Okay, this is to introduce Constantine. I've got 3 or 4 different angles to explain Constantine because it's basically the central focus of what Paul writes. He essentially assigns to Constantine the cause of church staying in the toilet for the rest of the church age. To demonstrate that, because it's a pretty, controversial thing to say, I have to first kind of go back through the meter to show you the trends of history that he's showing, irrespective of who it is. And then I'm going to go through the history of Constantine itself. I have many, many links that you can find on the internet to stuff on Constantine, so you can evaluate this for yourself. I don't like the guy, but I didn't dislike him very much until reading this stuff. But you know what? I didn't walk in his shoes, so I don't know what life was like for him. At the same time, he is used as the focal point in Paul. And here's how we're going to find out. Again, and you see it in small print now. Just look, I just want you to focus on these numbers here. Okay, and the 7, the 21, 28, 14. I just want you to focus on that pattern. And this, right here, because I don't want you to see the black, is the first quarter of church. This is the structure of Paul's meter. All the numbers here are semi-positive in meaning. 56 means that it's vote short, it's a pivotal time in history, will last 14 years, 14 of the voting period complete. It's symbolic and it's actual. It's actual time, and it's also symbolic of that time. When Christ was 56, history was at a pivotal point. Okay, and of course, like I said before, and hopefully you saw in the Mary Magnificat 11s GGS series, which is its own separate playlist you can watch by itself. Hopefully you saw that that's what Mary was mapping to. And then just like Mary had done, and hopefully you've seen Sanhedrin 97 through 99 now in the Talmud, just like the rabbis had done, Mary, of course, being related to rabbis, had done, she was mapping out what, Christ's arrival and the impact on history in light of the ambiguity in Daniel 9:26. And Paul is doing the same thing here. It's a tradition. Even the rabbis, because they couldn't read history, they'd screwed up their numbers, they were still doing this kind of practice in the 200s AD as shown in Sanhedrin 97 through 99 of the Talmud. So their numbers are screwed up, but the practice, the established tradition of the practice of counting down to Messiah is something that's as old as Psalm 90. Alright? So Paul is doing something just like Mary had done, just like Moses had done. It's an old practice of counting to Messiah, but they're focusing on the ambiguity in Daniel 9:26. Will church's completion still be in time for the pre-church schedule of what we call 94 AD, which would have been Christ's age 97, beginning his 98th year? That was when the millennium was supposed to start. And so when Paul is writing, he's still counting to that future old time, because church could have matured at that point. So the number 56 is evocative of the time when Israel was in diaspora. She had missed 49 sabbatical years. On top of those, 7 extra years had accrued. That's the origin, the accounting origin of the tribulation in Daniel 9:27. You saw that if you saw the Daniel videos in the Psalm 90 playlist. You saw that that's how Daniel was accounting it, and that's why God responds with the numbers he does in Daniel 9:25, 26, and 27. Metered to Daniel's own meter, which these people all knew. And they're using the same meter. They're focusing on the same numbers, the same issues. So Paul is using 56 here for that reason, just as Mary had done. 21, therefore, is a temple building number, the number of years that the Second Temple actually spent being constructed from the time its foundation was laid in 537 BC to the time it was completed in 516 BC. So 21 is a positive number. Okay, it means temple building. And Isaiah had used it, as you saw, and then 21 plus 7 is 28, very prominent number in Isaiah 53, when Isaiah was tracking the same thing. Okay, and that tradition again is still in the Talmud 220 years after Christ in Sanhedrin 97 through 99. Okay, so there's a track record on this. All right, but the rabbis don't talk about the meter, maybe because they all knew it so well, but they obviously forgot how it worked because their numbers are all screwed up. So 56 is twice 28. So Paul is talking about development. There's a positive value here. 7 is a tribulational number. The tribulation was expected to come in 77 AD to 84. That could have been a time when church would have been raptured, and then the tribulation would have begun. That's why it's scheduled. And it was a tribulational time in history, as I've gone through in the earlier versions of these 11 GGS videos. Okay, then it's followed. So if tribulation didn't happen, it's followed by another 21, which means there's a lot of positive volition still going on. And of course, Israel is still standing. I mean, not as a nation, but as an entity. Jerusalem is still standing. It was wiped out in 70 AD, but people are still living there. Okay, it wasn't until we get down here with our next 28 that, Jerusalem is razed to the ground again, and a Greek city-state, Roman Greek city-state, Aelia Capitolina, is built atop Jerusalem, and the Jews are forbidden to go in. But as you can see, these are relatively positive numbers. You got a 28 here, and it's palindrome here, 28 backwards and forwards, and then another 28 here, and then 14 represents changeover, pregnant changeover time in history, which of course it was in the aftermath, because this is Aelia Capitolina got finished 140 AD. All right, and so that's when everybody was, in diaspora. So that was a change, a new generation change. So this first quarter of church is signified by relatively positive numbers, even though church tanked, because church didn't meet the deadline. Okay, but it's still, there's a lot of positive volition growing. All right, and that's why the 14 is there, to show that it's still, there's a pregnant idea of the 14 of history, just like it was for Israel. Same symbolic meaning to it, and real meaning in real time. That was a very important time in history, pivotal to the continuation of history, as I've gone through in the videos. Okay, so notice that pattern. You got 21, 7, you got 21 here, 7 here, 21 here, 28 here, 14 here. Those are relatively positive numbers, culminating in 91, which was Zechariah's meter, when he was playing to Mary. That's the last episode of the Magnificat series showing Zechariah's own meter in Luke 1. And that's where Paul is getting his 91. He's also getting it from Daniel 9, and he's getting it really from Genesis 7 and 8. The 4 quarters that Noah was in the boat, using the LXX to trace Noah's time in the boat rather than the Hebrew. And I went through all that in the earlier section of the 10 GGS, the Noah time. Okay, so as you can see, there's a trend of the 28s. These are relatively positive numbers. And it continues. The 28 still continues. Why? Because now Jerusalem is no longer around. Aelia Capitolina was built, so now there's been a diaspora. Time to start over, start up lots of new little groups of Christians in diaspora. That was why God had diaspora for the Jews, was to protect the individual believer who just wanted to learn Bible from being too aggregated with all of the apostates. That's why he did it. Okay, and that's why he does it here. All right? So now in diaspora, the Christians. So there's a 28 here that's relatively positive. Okay, but then we get down here, and this is where Commodus comes in. Okay, Commodus is executed at this point, and this is where the Severans come in, and again, that's pregnancy. Mysterion stands for pregnancy, which Paul will stress in Ephesians 3. And now, instead of using 28, we're back to 56 again. So we've gone round robin. Okay, first quarter, we start with a 56, and the end of the second quarter, we end with a 56, but now pregnantly added to it, and this is where the crisis of the 3rd century begins. This is where there's, Severus gets executed, and you've got all those interim, wannabe Caesars playing games. Okay? This is called the crisis of the 3rd century by Roman historians. And so that's characterized by Paul as a 7. So it's a little less positive. Okay? You had 56s and 28s and 14s we saw in the first quarter here. All right? But now, the second quarter is not so positive. It's still got the same basic construction, but unfortunately, this extra 7 here means vote short, that you're not going to complete. You're not going to complete the 70. I'm sorry about my coffee. And the allergy continues until June. Okay, so that's the second quarter, the warring quarter. The warring and the harvesting quarter. Except for this 7, it's relatively positive. There's growth going on, is the point Paul makes. But it's seriously threatened here. So he characterizes that by a 7. Okay? This is when Rome breaks up. And it breaks up for the same reason that Jerusalem broke up, in order to free up Christians to get out of there, because God foreknows what's going to happen after 231. So man has his purpose for history, and God has his, and this 7 creates a sort of intensified tribulational style diaspora, so Christians will get out of Rome, get out of the areas that they've traditionally been in. In other words, the traditional areas that are references going into apostasy in Revelation 1 through 3, especially Revelation 3, those areas had really gone in the tank. But people were still living there because they were used to living there. Okay, well, all of this stuff caused them to start moving out. So they start moving to the hinterlands, which in the west would be Germany, Britain, Scotland, France. Okay, and in the east would be Parthia, basically. Okay, moving east into Parthia and India and Cappadocia and all that. I mean, Cappadocia had a cave, if I recall. Okay? So people were moving into more isolated areas as a result of all this warring going on. And that's what the 7 represents. Get out. And that's what they did. They had to. A lot of them had to. All right? And the Severan persecution of Christians wasn't as bad as people say on the internet. At least I can't find proof that it was bad as people say on the internet. There's a lot of stuff that's said on the internet that you can't prove true. All right? Some by very respectable people, unfortunately. So I can't prove that the Severan persecution of Christians was really an issue here. Macrinus, which is right here when Macrinus dies, he really was interested in persecuting, but he was too far away. He didn't have enough power. The Senate didn't like him. So whatever he wanted to do, he didn't accomplish. Okay, and the Severans come back into power here, but then they're out of power too. Okay? And this was, Severus and Heliogabalus, Alexander Severus, the kids, the nephews and nieces, the nephews and their mothers. Okay? So there's a kind of diaspora that happens right there. All right, so this 91 is a little less positive than the first one. And it represents warring and it represents harvest and diaspora, because that's the 7. Okay? Vote short. Christianity is just not getting the message. Okay, so God moves out the few. That's what tribulation always does. It's just like the pattern that is explained in Revelation. You move to the caves. You go into hiding. You go into 1s and 2s and small families and groups, and you take your scripture with you. And you don't try to band together as a group. The last thing you want is political power. But the apostates, a.k.a. the up and coming Catholic Church, are doing exactly the opposite. They're vying for political power, and they are the major cause of all this instability right here. Okay? They're the major cause. They're the bad guys. And that's all illustrated by 63. Because look, if the church fathers were as good as people say they were, and you know they're not when you read their own words, if they were that good, rapture would have happened by here. This is when those guys were their most prolific. Starting right in here is when they became most prolific. All right? And when they started to try to make all this, when Tertullian and Irenaeus before him and Origen after him, this Origen was alive during this time. If Origen was such a great believer, then Paul wouldn't have marked this with a 63 vote short. It's not majority rules, it's qualitative. If one person, just one of those church fathers, had been really advanced spiritually, this would not be a 63. It means nobody was developing. Okay? But there were some who were capable, there was potential, but they weren't actually developed. That's why it's 63 votes short. That's why you have a crisis in history. Okay? So then there's a turning point, because this happens, then this happens, and notice that 14 hooks up with 7 as a kind of 21, but it's outside the 91 building block that Paul's using. Paul is separating out this time as a unique period of its own, of 14, just like Moses had done in separating 14 up in Psalm 90 verses 1 through 4. That's exactly what Paul is doing. He's making a metrical parallel to the 14 of history that Israel kept missing. He's saying that church keeps missing it. We got a 7 here, but the 14 is outside. See, 14 was inside here, which means it was a turning point that was potential and part of the 91. But this 14 is outside it. That's bad news. So God is basically coming in to rescue. And this whole period, known to history as the crisis of the 3rd century, this is when you got the Decius persecutions, which really weren't that bad, but Decius made everybody get a piece of paper saying that he supported the Roman gods. And this is where Valerian comes in and Gallienus. Gallienus is kind of used by God as a sort of savior here, because Gallienus made more lax religious policies, so he sort of countermanded the garbage that was going on with the Christians here, and yet preserved them, because he made religion in his section more lax, more religious observance. You didn't have to, he was coming after Decius, and you didn't have to register with the Roman gods and register your fealty to the Roman gods in order to prove you were a loyal Roman citizen. You could practice whatever religion you wanted so long as you were a loyal Roman citizen. Okay, and he sort of curried favor with all Christians, not just the ones who here were writing prolifically against other Christians and calling them heretics. Okay, so Gallienus was used by God to fill up the church. So Paul considers that period so important, okay, under God, obviously, under God's, direction, that this 14 is set outside the 2nd quarter of church. And you're to expect, but I haven't proofed it out yet, that this is a recurring time trend of history. I haven't proofed that out yet to see just how much that idea fits real history. But it does fit right here. That you can prove. Alright, so then we go to our 3rd quarter, and it's nowhere near as nice. This is the period of the rise of our boys, Diocletian and Constantine. Right here. This 91 belongs to Diocletian and Constantine. It's not nice. You got, instead of a 56 directly, you got a 49. That tells you that church is just as bad as Israel was when God knocked down the temple. And notice where he reserves the meter. To this text, temple showbread. The knocking down of the temple due to 49 missed sabbatical years. So he uses 49. It's wry wit, saying that God is doing his own temple showbread plan. Because church, honey, you ain't making it. You aren't doing God's will. Now bear in mind, hope I'm not yelling too much, that this is now 301 AD. The so-called church fathers were at their height here in their writings. This was when Tertullian had already been out for about 80 years. You had Lactantius was busy, he was just getting started with his own writing. You had Eusebius, you had Origen had already been dead for about 40 years at this point, and was lauded by others of his ilk. These are the so-called church fathers being famous at this point and revered at this point in Antioch, Alexandria, and Rome, but not by God. God's calling them all a 49. God's saying, you guys are worthy of temple down, and by the way, I'm making my own temple showbread. Okay? I'm going to be saying a lot more about this in later videos on this, because Paul's doing a very sophisticated technique called anaphora, which all focuses on Constantine. So that's why this story is so complicated. But basically, just get the big picture here. Temple showbread is the verse at which Paul meters to divide by 7 at another 49. And that period ends 301, when most of the major so-called church fathers have done their writing. Paul's saying it's no good. That it's just as bad as Israel in diaspora. Okay? In other words, you've missed your sabbatical years. You haven't done the voting job you were supposed to do. You're out. But he's going to make his own temple showbread out of that same period. Okay? And this is the period when Constantine starts to rise. Because our boy, between 301 and 308, which Paul characterizes as tribulation quality, and it is, this is the period of the Diocletian persecution. Excuse me. This is when Constantine gets his rise to power. So how come Paul changes his meter 49 and 7? And I'm certain of that because of the way these anaphora work. They're all metered also. This is a sort of balance check on my meter. This was how I knew the meter was right. Is because each of these anaphora, which I'll cover in later videos, are all separately metered. Okay? To be divisible by 7 and by 3. It's awesome. So 301 is really what he's tracking to. He's centering, these are the main anaphora, and they all house during the period of Constantine. You see, all these little boxes represent the anaphora. And all of them are present the most right here during the time of Constantine when he rises to power beginning in 301. Okay? Constantine was born in 271. So in 301 he's just reached 30 years old. He's just at the age where he can actually begin to assert power. He's a very young man. He's full of himself. And we're going to see, how vile he was at that young age. Okay? Which Paul characterizes with 49. 7, tribulational quality. So the time of his rise to power is characterized as a tribulation. It's not favorably characterized. Why isn't this a 21? Why isn't this a 21? Why didn't Paul break this up into 21s? He doesn't. Because it's not good. So that's why you have persecution. Leviticus 26. When y'all don't listen to me, I'm going to bring disaster on you. Deuteronomy 28, same idea. Okay? Just go read those 2 chapters and you'll see it. God's rule for believers is you screw up, the world screws up, so I punish you. Well, the Diocletian persecution was a punishment. and everybody who didn't subscribe to the church fathers was no longer in Alexandria, Antioch, and Rome. They were in the hinterlands, so they weren't affected by the Diocletian persecution because Diocletian couldn't reach that far. Constantine Chlorus, the dad of Constantine, was in the upper west, in the hinterlands, and he didn't carry out Diocletian's policies. Okay, and when Constantine got there, Constantine didn't carry him out either. But I'll cover more of that in later videos because Constantine needed their support. Alright? He was not yet enmeshed with the bad boys of the church fathers because he didn't yet believe in Christ. In fact, what he's going to say about in hoc signo vinces, alright? That stupid argument that he made about seeing the stupid sign of the cross in the clouds, he makes that argument in 310, only 2 years earlier, saying that he saw Apollo in the clouds, promising him 20 years of victory. So what he says in 312 about allegedly converting to Christianity, he had already done 2 years before, citing a pagan god instead. We're going to see more of that in future episodes. Constantine was not a believer here. Okay? But he was lenient to the Christians because he was in the hinterlands. So God isn't saying anything nice about him. Only it gets worse because in 308 is when he does come to power. In 308, that's the agreement at Carnuntum. This is when Constantine is officially recognized by all the legal parties as having the rights to his control of the upper western part of Europe. Alright? And he uses that as his power base in order to take over Rome 4 years later, which we'll explain, see in future videos. Meanwhile, this period, this tribulational period with the persecutions, basically it doesn't completely end, but it fizzles out. Okay, and God's not giving the Christians a good vote. He punished them. That's what the 7 means. Alright, so now look. What do we have here? Oh, man. It's not a 28. It's not a 56, but a measly 35. 35, ever since Psalm 90, represents God's vote. The idea is for man to vote in return so that 35 and 35 will equal 70. I've covered that in the Psalm 90 playlist. I covered that symbolic meaning here in this Ephesians 1 document. Okay? 35 means God's the only one's voting. So from 308, when Constantine comes to power, and this includes his sons, all that time after his alleged conversion to Christianity, which probably was a real conversion, even if only for expediency's sake, the sons are all warring with each other and killing fellow Christians over whether God is 1 or 3. That's what's happening during this period. So the only one voting is God, signified by 35. So this 91 is not a positive thing. It's 49 saying Christianity is so bad it's like diaspora for the Jews. The 7, God's punishing the Christians. 35, God's the only one voting. And that completes the 3rd quarter of church. Now, it gets even worse. The 4th quarter of church is not divisible by 7 until the last verse in this section, which ends the last anaphora, which was also the first one. Well, not the first one. Okay? This is the last anaphora that I'll have to cover. 91, there is no 49. There's no 7. There's no God voting 35. There's only the Holy Spirit voting 91. What this tells you is that nobody's growing. So time ends with a cliffhanger. Oops. Time ends with a cliffhanger. Let's get that up. Here's the cliffhanger. 434. 434 and 56 is 490. Paul is saying that the same 56 with which he began is the same ending that Daniel 9 uses. The 56 is left in abeyance. Church might not complete. And the vote is so bad, there aren't even any segments divisible by 7. That means it's all up to the individuals, which is exactly how Paul had ended the third quarter. God's voting to develop who? The proepikotas, first fruits. First fruits were individual sheaves that you presented in the temple on the beginning of the count of the Omer, okay, and on Pentecost. Okay, they used those sheaves to make the showbread. It was a special kind of showbread. All right, you waved them before God, and they made bread out of them. First fruits of the showbread. This is a special anaphora that I'll have to cover in future videos that Paul uses. He uses protesin is the second part of the anaphora. This is the third. And then the first one was back up here. Proeteto. This is a special anaphora that Paul meters. And it all focuses on Constantine, the aftermath of Constantine. The aftermath of Constantine is this, proepikotas. Now that happens to stand for the very period when the first fruits of Constantine's own loins are killing each other and killing other Christians over whether God is one or three. That period in history is what happens then. So the first fruits of Constantine are destroying Christianity. But God's making his own first fruits out of individuals. Individuals. That's what proepikotas mean. Individual sheaves that you presented at a temple, you waved before God to acknowledge the fact that the harvest was something God voted to produce. God votes. 35. See how the meter interacts with the text? See how important it is to know that Paul is referencing a specific period in history to tell you Christianity is totally in the tank under Constantine, whom of course everybody wrongly praises as such a spiritual guy. You can read his own writings. They're also preserved at ccel.org. His writings are preserved, apparently transcribed by Eusebius or somebody. When you read what Constantine wrote about God, he's the biggest jerk I've ever heard in my life. He's almost as bad as Clement of Rome. Completely has absolutely no knowledge of Bible at all. Unless it's ghost written, in which case the idea of Constantine they wanted to promote proves that nobody cared about God at all. They only cared about buttressing their own religious self-opinion, just like the rabbis. They're just as bad as the rabbinical writings in the Talmud. Easily as bad. Two sides of a coin. The church father writings, Constantine's laws, and his kids during this very period that's designated by proepikotas are killing each other and killing other Christians over the question of whether God is one or three. And that trend will continue for the next 200 years. So only God is voting. And what is he voting? He's voting to develop first fruits. Proepikotas, the end of what I like to call the temple trio anaphora in this document, which I'll have to cover in later videos. It's very complicated. But you get the point? The last time there are segments of individuals is right here. After that, nothing. Only the Holy Spirit is voting. In other words, there are so few believers growing. Of course, this is the time of the Dark Ages. This is when we enter the Dark Ages right here. There's so few believers growing that God doesn't even have Paul meter it until it gets to 91. And of course, the fourth quarter is winter. Nothing grows in winter. Okay? I mean, basically nothing grows in winter. Now, in winter, I don't know if you've seen snow-covered mountains before, or you've been in the mountains, but in winter, basically nothing grows, except every once in a while, great while, very rarely, you'll see a flower stick up. Okay? Or you'll see some kind of seedling stick up. It's very rare, but it does happen. Okay? Usually, if you go to the Weather Channel, or, a Wonder, that Wonder Net weather thing, sometimes they'll shoot photographs of flowers in the snow, flowers blooming in the snow. That's basically all that happens here. Too few to meter. See, there were enough that you could at least meter. There were enough believers voting and growing, at least growing a little. They weren't maturing, but they were growing. And there were enough here that God voted. Okay? But here, it's invisible. It's winter. The growth is invisible and very rare, one individual every now and then, such that the last 56 years of every 490 years of church history is always in doubt. That's the trend. And it's all because Constantine rose to power, and that's when the Roman Catholic Church rose to power. Now, again, I know I'm focusing on them because they happen to be the poster boy that, rose to power. But they aren't the only game in town anymore. Paul's characterizing this as a trend of history. Everybody and his brother now is a pope. Everybody and his brother now is easily as legalistic and self-righteous as the horrible church father writings that took off, that were all venerated and passed around during this period and, institutionalized under Constantine. All the church politics, all the Borgias, everything has its origin right here. The horror that we know of the history of the Catholic Church begins here in this black period and lasts until the Reformation. But honey, the Protestants weren't much better. Have you ever read about the persecutions by Protestants? Have you ever paid attention to what a lot of the Protestant denominations say today? Everybody and his brother's got his little vision from God. Everybody and his brother's little pope. So, before we want to wag the finger too much at the Catholic Church, even though, yes, they're being spotlighted by Paul, they're spotlighted by Paul because this is when they unite with the state. There are a lot of them now. There are 24,000 denominations of Christianity, and 23,999 of them, maybe not that many, but close, are all their little own popedoms. You got the JW popedom, you got the SDA popedom, you got the, I'm going to miss off, the Hebrew Roots popedom. Everybody's, the direct voice of God now. And it all started right here. Revelation 17, honey, is true of Christianity in general, not just the Catholic Church. And Paul illustrates that as a trend in history, showing that, by the way, from 343 AD onward, only the few are going to be developed, and they are so few that they're not even metered. This is the winter quarter. Now, my guess is that when Paul did this, going back to the whole page view, my guess is that when Paul did this, he's saying that every 490 is going to work like this. And what I don't know, and it's going to be a pistol to figure it out, is can I prove that you got 490 years being depicted here? Okay, so do I go back to year 434 plus 56, year 490 AD, and do I see a new spring occurring for a new first quarter with these same trends? Can I prove that happened? I don't know if I can prove it. But that's what I suspect Paul means by this. that he's mapping out the actual first 434 years of history. And of course, in year 434 AD, that's when Odovac arises, and in 476 AD, the Western Romance. Okay? Is Paul saying that those same historical kinds of events just play over and over and over, since the trend is Daniel 9:26c, a time bubble that should have lasted 50 years but ends up lasting as long as it takes? Is Paul mapping each 91 as a recurring specific amount of time? Or is this just is a pattern, and it can occur in different configurations but still the same basic idea? And that I don't know. But what I wanted to get across in this video is this is the period of the rise to power of Constantine. It is characterized by negative ideas, negative symbolism. 49, Christianity, just like Judaism, was in the tank so badly it went into diaspora and the temple was destroyed. That's what 49 means. 7, God punishes. That's the Diocletian persecution right here, when Constantine rises to power as a pagan. But then when he converts to Christianity, the numbers don't improve. They're actually worse. The only one voting is God. And what's God voting for? Not Constantine. He's voting for his own proerpicotas, because Constantine's own proerpicotas, the fruits of his own loins, are busy killing each other and other Christians during that very time period. So what's God doing? He's not voting for Constantine. He's not voting for the Christianity that developed under Constantine and institutionalizes during this time. God is instead voting for individual sheaves, individual believers, and they're the ones carrying history. And there are so few of them, you can't even meter the last quarter of the trend. It's just the 91, telling you that yes, time will continue, yes, God's will be done, but honey, Christianity as an entity, as an institution, as a group, ain't contributing squat except the trouble. And so that's why he says, remember God. God is your down payment on this inheritance of ours, our redemption. Praise for his glory. Not even a group of Christians or a group of time being separately marked out, because all that's left are the individual sheaves, silently and invisibly being developed by the vote in the last quarter of every 490 by the Holy Spirit. In the next segment, we're going to start going into the history of this period, so you can see how what I've just told you in this video ties.